the syllabus says vulnerability assessments there, the second bullet point, and SIPs are very keen to distinguish between a risk assessment and a vulnerability assessment. They've examined this about twice before, and it's a very subtle difference. I know the students...
So it's a difference between risk assessment...
Yeah, and vulnerability assessment.
Okay.
So there's a slight difference. Because you've got a vulnerability, that could be a risk. But identifying vulnerabilities is slightly different than, not much, than the full risk assessment. So in risk management, you will identify the risks. In some ways, a vulnerability assessment is a way of finding weaknesses, particularly in IT systems that are vulnerable to attack. But the risk would be that someone exploits that vulnerability and steals data, and that. So just on a definition, it's ever so slightly different. And you can see there is a definition. It's a process to identify, quantify and prioritize areas which a system is open to risk or attack. It is a form of risk assessment for weak spots.
If the vulnerability is identified,
yeah,
something can be done to it, can't it?
Yes, that's right. So once you've identified the weak stock, or how to do it, is list your resources in the supply chain, give a score, a ranking to the importance of the resources. Are they important? Does it matter? Look for the vulnerabilities, and then plan to eliminate, as you quite rightly said, the vulnerabilities. So it's very similar to risk management, but they are expecting this points of weakness, risk or attack to be mentioned. But basically you wouldn't just leave them unless the asset didn't matter. So vulnerability generally associated with IT systems. Are they vulnerable to attack? Is there weaknesses in the firewalls? So vulnerability there. And then a very general slide, benefits of risk management. Now that slide could be benefits of having ISO 31000. It is general benefits of good planning. It avoids costs, avoids risk. Quite a generic list there, but quite a good...
ISO, what?
There's what, sorry, Yabo?
You said it's benefits of risk management is having ISO.
Oh, sorry, it's almost the same slide as benefits of having ISO 31000, which is a risk management standard. So the benefits of having risk management are similar to the benefits of having good governance, and the international standard is ISO 31000, which we're going to look at briefly today. So there is an international standard on risk management. And if you look at that, which I can send copies of and we can look at videos, the benefits are of course the same benefits here. So you do need for this unit a generic list of why we should have risk management, what are the benefits. But that is almost benefits of good procurement, benefits of planning, benefits of good governance. It's quite general. Not one you can learn today, but it's fairly easy. Protects market share, protects reputation, involves stakeholders, secures supply by mitigating vulnerability, avoids disruption, minimises costs. So quite wide ranging. Just 2 seconds. I've got some exam papers for SIPs coming today. I'm just checking we didn't miss the post there. Right, so benefits of risk management. General techniques for identifying risk. Just general techniques. So remember this 3.1 is about assessing the impact and probability, but we need to identify the risks first. And this is just a very general list of how we might find risks. Looking at academic research, Steeple, SWOT, monitoring events, market intelligence, critical incident investigations, things that's gone wrong before, doing scenario analysis, audits, inspections, examine project plans and supply chain maps. So supply chain mapping is a very important technique in identifying risks in supply chains. doing a proper risk assessment, talking to stakeholders, using third-party auditors and consultants, which is part of section 3 on the level 6 one is that. So there, brainstorming could be used, lessons learnt from previous problems, templates. So there's a fairly broad ranging list. There isn't a correct answer, but you could get part of a good answer might just discuss briefly how you firstly identify the risks. Now once you've identified them, what would you do after that, Yabu? So we've got a list of risks. What would we do now?
Once you've identified them, you have to put prevention in place.
Yeah, and the prevention measures you take in place would depend on what? They depend on, think of the definition, impact times probability.
Yeah, it will depend on the impact. It will have on the organisation if it happens.
That's right. So basically we have to look at, is it likely to happen? And then if it did happen, what's the impact? And then we can grade the risk red, amber, green, probably. Red, that's too dangerous, stop. Amber, we need to do something. Green, we can just monitor it. So risk assessment, likelihood times impact, and that can be qualitative or quantitative. If it's quantitative, you'd call it probability. So that's a fairly common way of assessing risk. Look at, as you say, how likely it's to happen, what's the impact. Then if you've got high and high, that would be red, etc. So there's the typical risk assessment grid that you need to cite in an exam. It's fairly common to SIPs. If it's a low risk, low impact, you probably don't need to do anything. If it's high risk, high impact, it's red, it's dangerous, you would need to treat the risk. It's too dangerous, so you'd need to mitigate it. So that's a very, very simple risk assessment grid. And you can see there, typically score, 2 highs would be red, high moderate red, high low amber. This isn't cast in stone, everyone's got slight different versions. And you can see low low would be green, and that would give you your colour coding. And there's the RAG system which most companies use. It's very simple, but it's widely used. So red is unacceptable, amber needs to be managed, and green probably not much of a worry, just monitor it. And that's, you've probably seen the RAG before, have you, Yabu system?
No, I've not seen it, but I've heard about it.
Yeah, so on a risk register you would have, in the sort of middle column, you'd colour it red, amber or green so you could quickly see which were the dangerous risks. You can just give it numbers if you so wish, but the coloured system works well. There's an example of red, amber, green. So the dangerous risks, the red ones here, unacceptable, the amber ones and the green ones. So that's a 3x3 chart, and a more complex one there is a 5x5, and you can give it numbers if you so wish for scoring. So anything above 10 on this is red, so 5 times 2 is 10, 5 times 5 is 25. They haven't worked the scores out in the boxes, but you can see roughly the higher the score, the more likely it is to be red. So that's an impact probability matrix, and that would be part of a very good answer if they ask you about how you would assess the likelihood and impact. Well, you'd assess probability on, is it likely to happen or not likely to happen, and the impact on how severe it is, how big the impact is. That's the one from the study guide, which is a bit odd because they've got high probability here, low this way, and on this one they've got low high, so it goes low high, high low, which is a bit silly. I don't like them drawn like that, but that's a way of doing it. And obviously the dangerous risks are the catastrophic risks there. Another one from the study guide which is slightly better because they've drawn the axis right. 0 to 10 that way.
This is the same as that one you showed.
It is the same. So it's just the same. York University which shows how they've done a risk assessment on their finance, human resources, etc. So in my revision notes, which I seem to have forgot to send you, you'll find in 4.1 there's a very good example of how a real university is doing their risk assessment. It only lasts 3/4 of a page, and it's very informative. It just brings it all together. So have a look at that when I email you a bit later, you boo, or when you're doing some exam questions. So was to use scenario analysis, and these theories might give you some of the probabilities. Unit, so I'm saying it's there in your study guide, but personally I would ignore it. And you can put a note, there's never been a good answer that needed this concept. So I know I've left the slide there, but I would say ignore it. It's to do with investment and firms having a balanced portfolio of investments. It's not to do with supply chain risk.
This book doesn't talk much about investment risks, because I read in chapter 5,
Yep,
it just mentioned it and said don't worry about it.
that's right. Yeah, don't go there. So same as this, just it's there in the book somewhere, but ignore it. So right, a bit more straightforward then. So once we've, very similar this, basically how do we use risk registers, which are used in procurement, and most of the procurement staff I teach on a weekend and evening, not all of them, but maybe 70% at work have risk registers. And that's what most people have. They don't have that silly impact assessment grid. They use a template and they fill in. So why do we use one? Captures risks. It allows information to be recorded. Visibility. Accountability, because once we've identified a risk, we'll assign it in the risk register to say me or you'll be assigned with managing it. It gives us a framework. It encourages communication, etc. So there are several benefits of having a risk register. Most people have a standard template at work. There isn't a standard. A reference number, a description of the risk, date, risk owner, probability, impact, responses, mitigation action, and updated. You use that one. So the risk register is a nice easy question. I think it came up in November or this January. It's a very regular assessed question. But somewhere I've got one that's got, rather than the blank there's a better one that's got the actual colours in. And I'll see if I can follow that. What are line managers responsible for in managing risk? So your line manager, they're there to implement, enforce the policies, reinforce a risk-aware culture, report events, capture information. So fairly general. What do line managers do? Well, they can't just say it's not my job. It is their job. What do procurement do? Well, they help identify supply chain risk, qualify suppliers, develop contracts, manage contracts, supply information, manage risks. So their whole job is about managing risks, isn't it? Making sure you've got good suppliers, that the contracts are in place, that they're following the contracts, and that you're taking due diligence when you're doing your sourcing and outsourcing. So fairly general. What does procurement do? Public sector, who helps manage risk? Treasury, Audit Office, the Audit Commission, PAC, or the proper name, Public Accounts Committee. So they're important bodies. In education, you might say Ofsted, who audit schools. So there are many risk management bodies who participate. So we've got controls, and then a whole range of how do we mitigate risk mitigation measures. It's a huge slide, this. Identifying, testing systems, preventive maintenance, making sure our IT systems are robust, rules, protocols, systems maintenance. So a whole sort of general way of managing risk, training staff, internal controls, database manager, having good suppliers, you name it, they can all help manage risk. And that's pretty much 4.2. Now, this section is very important because it introduces you for the first time to the international standard on risk. Sometimes with students, when we start risk, I teach them the international standard first, and then we start the rest of the unit, because you can't work in procurement and not know about the international standard. It's so important. The study guide has a bit about it, I think 3 pages, and the other standard is ISO 28000, which is information security, which we'll look at. Reporting and resources, so a big section, how to develop a risk management culture. Well, that means you need a framework, a strategy, policies and procedures in place, otherwise people aren't bothered. A bit like quality management, it's got to start at the top, they've got to be serious, they've got to have a policy and a strategy. Same as that slide, it's the wording, and these are in my study notes. We need to firstly, we can't do it in a vacuum, so we need to look at the organisation, its risk appetite. We need to look at the PESTEL, external environment, look at the culture, and we need to articulate the risk appetite. Once we've done that, we've got this very important box here which is worth learning. So the ISO standard says to assess risk, you do 3 things. You identify the risk, you analyse the risk, then you evaluate the risk, and once you've done that, you treat it, the 4 T's, and there's communication and feedback throughout. So this final box, and this is how you do it in the supply chain. To assess risk in the supply chain, identify the risk, analyse the risk, evaluate the risk, treat the risk, monitor and control, feedback, start again. So the international standard, you can't ask your suppliers to have this because you can't be accredited to it. This standard guides companies on how to implement risk management in their company. So it provides principles and a framework and processes that companies can adapt for their own needs. So it's a very, very important standard, and it only came out in 2009. Although you might say that's old, it's fairly recent in international standard terms. I've got quite a bit more detail in my notes, but not too much. But I've gone more into explaining some of these key terms.
What kind of questions will they ask that will
Right.
be able to
Yeah,
this?
they've asked, I think, 2 from memory. One is discuss how international standards might be useful in risk management. And I think the other question they once asked is discuss how you would implement ISO 31000, because it's named in the unit content. So there has been 2 questions, and I will double check that. Certainly one was just a general how might you use standards, and a good answer was ISO 31000 would give you a framework for putting it in, it's based on principles, there's a clear framework, processes, etc. So it has been asked, not much, but it has been asked, so there's no getting away. You have to know a little bit about it, but not the fine detail, just an holistic high level overview. It's okay, I'm just looking at a student's results there. Someone else has passed an exam and failed an exam. Right, not good. Yeah, someone failed category management and passed I think it was the case study. No, they didn't do the case study. It was a different one. It was operations management they passed, sorry, and category management they failed. Yeah, but that's the danger. If you sit 2, it can be quite difficult, can't it?
I got 50 in category management and 52 in operations management.
Oh, that's pretty good. Yeah, well, as long as you get 50, it doesn't matter, does it? So that's the ISO standard, and I think I've got a slide that revises that for 1000, which is a security management system. They won't ask you about it, I can't find hardly any companies that's got this standard. I don't think it's very widely used, but it is named in the unit content, and it's about security issues of the supply processes within logistics. So it may be that your logistics supplier or the let's say somewhere like Felixstowe might have this standard that they've got property security management in, so that the containers coming in and out are secure and the information. So it's supposed to it's the first international standard on supply chain security risk. So it's to do with security of cargo and information. It's similar in layout to ISO 14001, but it isn't obviously the same. And it focuses on managing and reducing risks. I'm not a big fan of it, but it is a standard you can cite in your exam. And at best, I would guess this slide is probably double the content that you would need to know. So you just need a very basic understanding of it. Because if they ask you about international standards, you can say, well, there's ISO 31000, explain that in detail. And you might say ISO 28000 could be useful because that's security management in the supply chain, but you wouldn't need particular much detail there.
But that ISO 28000 is not international, is it?
Yeah, it's an international because it's ISO. It isn't British standard, so ISO is international. So international standards, so it's, yeah. So companies anywhere in the world could have ISO 28000.
Okay.
Now if it said BS, it would only be British, of course.
Okay.
So there's two standards there we've briefly...
Same.
Yeah, so they're all the features that would be needed for it to be effective. Pretty similar to the 9001 really, if you change the words, or 14001. You need a policy that's got objectives and targets, you need a structure, you need competent staff, you need to plan, you need to document, etc. So it's a fairly standard format for most systems, because you can see the S is a system, 14001 is a system, ISO 9001 is a system. So that's, it looks complicated, but that isn't when you drill down into it. In organisations, because of corporate governance, there will be usually a risk management committee, particularly in bigger companies, and their job is to look at the risk management policy, review how risks manage in the company, communicate risk to the board of directors and to the managers, review the risk register, and champion risk management. So part of good governance is most of the big companies in the UK have to have a risk management committee who oversees, not the directors, who oversee how risk is managed in the company. And that's a very important function in all companies, and that's linked to the UK Combined Code. That is pretty much a UK thing. It could be different in America and it could be different elsewhere. So that's quite UK, but I think good practice throughout the world has been adapted, if I'm being honest. So Risk Management Committee, there is a pressure to report externally. So rather than just report internally to managers, companies have to report how well they're doing on CSR, what their targets are, whether they're following the UK Combined Code, how they're appointing directors. So they've got to be very transparent, accountable, and the pressure comes from regulation, the stakeholders, the governance system, and to protect reputational and other benefits. So you'll get a good reputation hopefully if you're very straightforward and disclose information. So there's there's 4 things there why you need to externally report. And there was one question, I can't remember if it's 5 or 10 marks, that said discuss why companies need to externally report, and the answer was just these 4 points here with just a few words extra. So fairly common sense really is why companies need to clearly report to stakeholders it's not just regulation, it's expectations, it's good governance, and it instills confidence and protects reputation. And if you don't do that, the opposite happens, that you're going to lose the trust of stakeholders, you could get reputational damage, etc. Now the regulation can be the UK Governance Code or Sarbanes-Oxley if you're American. It could be the stock exchange regulations. Other regulation could be, and I've forgotten the name, we've got the Companies Act. The Companies Act requires UK companies to disclose in their reports certain information. So there are certain regulations. Stakeholder expectations are generic. Governance, reputation, are what they are. There's the Companies Act, and it's been updated in 2013. And this regulates by law that companies must put certain things in their, not their accounts, but their annual report. So they've got to discuss in their report their key risks and uncertainties, describe their strategy, and gather information on gender diversity, etc. So these are the compulsory requirements of any company operating in the UK because of regulation. They're not going to ask you about the Companies Act. It could be just, again, part of a small part of an answer. And you can see I've mentioned here the UK Governance Code. And all this requires companies to report information, partly because it helps you make a decision whether you want to invest in that company, whether you think they're being run properly, whether they've got good governance, whether they're... But you might read someone's report and say, I don't like that, there's too many risks coming up that they've mentioned, I won't put my money there. So it's good business. Risk culture is risk culture. And can you see it says here that you might have to embed the behaviours, policies, procedures, rules, systems. So what it's saying there is you might need to change some of that.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Okay.
It's a good model from Johnson & Scholes, and you'll come across it on your studies, but again, it's never going to be a big question. We need to make sure we didn't give enough resources to risk management, which are just a general list of resources, information through to finance. So it won't just happen. We might need to have people assigned to it. We need time, money, so we need to resource it. We might involve suppliers, encouraging risk awareness at all points of contact, developing cross-functional collaboration, gathering information. So by involving suppliers and probably having collaborative relationships, that can reduce risk, improved information flows, more motivation, they're less likely to let you down. Very generic that. Right, and then we're on to what I think is the interesting one that's very, very, very heavily examined, because 4.4 is all but the same learning outcome as 3.4. So the question usually comes in 3 or 4, but usually in one of the exams, one of these comes in. So generally they might ask you about how to develop a continuity plan, or they might ask you how to do a disaster recovery plan. They could ask you how to develop a risk management strategy, but usually it's continuity planning or disaster recovery planning. They're the examiner's favourites. And having a continuity plan or recovery plan is part of a strategy to mitigate risks. But most companies set a policy, a strategy that outlines how they're going to manage it, what their risk appetite is, and the process for managing risk. So there's quite a formal process, and ISO 31000 details how to develop a strategy. These are the particular methods. Slide again, similar, aims, object 6 or the 8. Contingency planning is about making sure you've thought about the black swan events, the things that you didn't think could happen but do happen. So a term in risk management, I think we covered that the other week, is black swan event. which is an unforeseen event which causes havoc, very hard to predict, and it dates back I think to the 1700s when they discovered black swans in Australia. Previously that people didn't think black swans could exist or did exist, but they were there. So that showed you've got to be careful on your assumptions. So be prepared. Right, we've got to be careful here. Contingency planning, continuity planning, disaster recovery planning. 3 headings. Strictly contingency recognises that many risks can't be eliminated. Risks may be low probability, high impact, and it may be that you just have a contingency plan in place. Strictly contingency planning is 6 steps. This isn't continuity, and this is again from the study guide. Identify the risks, evaluate them, document, train, communicate. So they're the standard risk management process really. And business continuity planning is really a specialist form of contingency planning where you're trying to plan to keep the organisation running. So that's a subtle difference there. That's contingency. And a definition: contingency just to plan if something happens, whereas business continuity management slightly bigger. It helps manage risk to keep the company going. The risk could be from external or from within, and it's a much so it is a form of contingency planning, but it's specific to keeping your business running. So, you know, is somebody trained up if the MD drops dead? Have we got continuity planning? Have we got backup in our systems? It isn't just about disaster recovery, it's recovering from minor problems. Management as opposed to business continuity on the other slide. So obviously management is the process of managing, doing business continuity. So this perhaps is the more useful definition. An holistic management process to ensure operations continue. Brands are protected, reputations are safeguarded. So I would suggest that's pretty useful. Now ISO 23021 is not in the study guide. It's in the new ones from July, but the examiner is not expecting you to know the details of it. You can learn the definitions. The study guide has got the rather dated business continuity modelling, which I've kept in because the examiner likes it, and it's the basis of a good answer. So we'll very similar to that slide as to what are the benefits. So they're the doing ones. How do we do it then? This is the one to learn. This is from the Business Continuity Institute. So we do the business risk assessment. We develop the plan. We document it. Then we have to test the plan, check it works. Could be a real life plan or it could be a desktop test. And then we need to maintain the plan. So that's quite easy, 5 steps, but that's not in the study guide. That's from the business continuity journals, and there's variations on it. The examiner usually says there are many versions of the business continuity model. A typical one will show 5 steps. So as long as you've got a 5-step model, discuss the 5 P's, and if you can and if at stage 1 you can be very clear what a business impact analysis is, it's slightly different than risk assessment. It's looking at the impact as it says on the business. So continuity is about, well, if you left tomorrow, how would that impact your business? So business impact analysis is looking at all business functions and how disruption might affect them. It assesses how much you could lose. It looks at worst case, and it looks at financial and operational impacts. And it's about calculating your RTOs. So if you went into work tomorrow and the place has collapsed, how quickly would you need it up and running? 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 1 day? So you need some clear objectives, which are called, at a high level, RTOs, because that will affect the cost of the policy, etc., etc. So business impact analysis, this one. So we've got business impact analysis versus risk assessment. There's a subtle difference. So at stage 1 you do both of these, but there are slight differences between impact analysis on the business and a risk assessment. And if you look at that, you can see some quite subtle differences. But basically you need to say you do both them at stage 1. They aren't going to ask you to compare them. So don't worry about comparing them. That slide is just there to help you understand a subtle difference. So what is business continuity about? Succession planning, knowledge management, very important for us. Supplier transition planning, making sure when we change supplier we don't disrupt the whole place and we don't lose our...
The thing I can see is succession planning.
You can see the succession planning.
I see succession planning. I see knowledge management. I've not seen the PCP includes measurement. So I can't see this one you're showing me.
What, you can't see that in the study guide?
No.
No, it could be.
LO4 said succession planning.
Yeah.
And it went on to knowledge management.
But it's also about those, and I think this slide is taken from an examiner's report that said a good answer discussed all these.
All right.
So I think that's where that came from, you boo. So it gives you a broad area what to discuss. You know, if you have to talk about business continuity, you can talk about disaster recovery planning's part of it, changing your new IT system, new suppliers. So fairly broad brush strokes. Succession planning, I think everyone sort of knows what that is, about key positions, reviewing jobs, performance appraisal, talent management, recruitment. So it's making sure that we're planning for the MD to retire in a year's time, or we're looking at bringing what would happen if someone left. Have we got people trained up? So it's quite, I think, obvious what succession planning is. Knowledge management's important because of innovation, competition, loss in knowledge. So we need to manage our knowledge, develop knowledge. We need to have a systematic approach to knowledge management. This is really taken from some of the other units, and they've just filled in with these slides that we need to capture knowledge, internalise it, make it tacit instead of make it explicit. We need to plan new suppliers when we're changing suppliers, prepare, make sure the contract's got a transition plan or a stepping clause if it's outsourcing. Make sure stakeholders are ready and informed, and have contract management review. So again, good.
This disaster recovery planning and things like that is not done by procurement.
No, it isn't. It really, it isn't. I think where it affects procurement, you boo, is if I'm buying for a manufacturing company and I've got a single supplier, I wouldn't want to be dealing with them if they didn't have a disaster recovery plan, because they're going to let me down. You would be saying to them, have you got a DRP? What is it? Let's have a look at it. And if it isn't, now if their plan is to be up and running within 2 weeks, well, that might not be quick enough for you. Or they might not have a DRP. So in which case you wouldn't approve them. You'd say, well, sorry, we can't deal with you. So often it's a minimum requirement for suppliers. But as you say, realistically at work we aren't involved in it really, are we? It's done by the management. So I tend to agree with you on that. But with suppliers we can bring it into supplier assessment, BCP and contingency planning. There are some good videos there that are worth looking at nearer the time for revision on business continuity, successful planning and disaster recovery. But the section's quite good. It's quite a straightforward section, is section 4. And I think that brings us to the end of that section. I need to